How did David make it through the difficult days in his life? How did he make it through life when everything fell apart and things took a turn for the worse? Here's how. He remembered. He literally remembered. He remembered how God came through for him time and time again. Remembering is what built his faith up, which is a great reminder for us today. Today we will work through Psalm chapter 9 and see why remembering is so important to growing up in our faith and making it through the difficult days. Welcome to our Psalm series. Glad you're joining us today. For the past Psalms that we have been studying, we've seen David write these Psalms and pour his heart out and write about things that were concerning him or upsetting him. He wrote Psalms when he was running for his life from King Saul. He was writing Psalms when he was running from his son Absalom, who had taken over his throne. We saw him write so often out of fear and anxiety, and then we'd see him write, songs of praise and trust in God. Most of these Psalms were written later on in David's life. So today what I want to do is I want to set up this Psalm, and I want to go all the way back to David as a teenager. Because what happened with David as a teenager will help him remember the faithfulness of God. And it seems like that's why he's writing Psalm 9 today as we go through this. So let's start at the beginning here. It says, Psalm 9, for the director of music, to the tune of The Death of the Son, a Psalm of David. Now, there's a couple different ideas on why this psalm was written. We'll read this. Some associate the title with the phrase, the death of the son, and apply that title as the ancient Chaldee version does, concerning the death of the champion who went out between the camps, referring to Goliath. Perhaps David wrote this psalm remembering the victory over Goliath from the vantage point of many years since that triumph. So a lot of people think that this particular psalm was written because of the whole thing that happened with David killing Goliath. Another commentary said that they think that death of the son might be about his son Absalom, but I tend to take the first version where it has something to do with Goliath, because what we see David doing is this. He remembers. He remembers. So let's start here. Hence why I have this scene in the background. Here is going to be little David, okay, up against over here the big giant Goliath and the armies of the Philistines. So I want this to be kind of a picture for you to be able to see, so you can see what's going on in this particular psalm. Now, David had apparently this amazing relationship with God as a young boy. He took care of his family's sheep. I bet when he was out there at night, he would look up at the sky and he saw the magnificence of God. I bet he took his little harp out there and he sang songs and he praised and he worshiped God. And we could see David's heart all the way back then by doing those kind of things. At this particular time, David was the youngest of 8 sons. He was the little brother who was just the shepherd of the family. But one day something happens. And because what David doesn't know is that they have a king in Israel, King Saul, but God had rejected him. And now God had sent Samuel to go find the next king. So let's pick up our story in 1 Samuel 16. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I provided myself a king among his sons. So the prophet Samuel, a prophet was someone who spoke for God. God would speak to them, and then they would speak and say, God said this. So he goes to Bethlehem under the guise of sacrificing to the Lord. So he invites Jesse and his family to the sacrifice. And knowing all along that he's really there to look for the next king of Israel. So Jesse's sons are paraded before him, and one of his sons, Eliab, apparently looked like a king. Tall, dark, handsome, whatever that was like. But look at verse 6. It says, "So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, 'Surely the Lord's anointed is before him.'" Like, of course this would be the king. He just looks kingly. But look at verse 7. "But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.'" With each son that's passed before him, he knew none of these were the right guys. Verse 11 said, "And Samuel said to Jesse, 'Are all the young men here?' Then he said, 'Well, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is, keeping the sheep.' And Samuel said to Jesse, 'Send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here.' So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is the one.' Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah." Imagine a young teenage boy invited to see the prophet Samuel. And I bet he was shocked when suddenly he's anointed with oil to be the next king of Israel. But David was probably confused. Like, hello, we already have a king. Like, why? I don't understand what's going on. So David does what David does, which is just go back and deal with the sheep out in the pastures. But then something happens. The dreaded Philistines were at battle with Israel at this particular time. David's out in the field doing what he's supposed to be doing. We'll pick up the story in 1 Samuel 17. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Hence why we have our backdrop here. Because that's what David was going to be up against. A giant with the Philistines right behind him, this evil, wicked group of people. And out of it was this man that was so huge and everyone was terrified of him. Verse 5 says he had a bronze helmet on his head and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had a bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. This was a massive man, and he was terrifying to the Israelites. Verse 8 said, "Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said, 'Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.'" This was a big deal for Israel. And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That shows you exactly why God said, "I don't want Saul to be the king anymore." Because Saul had no idea what God could do. He didn't trust him. He didn't put his faith and trust in him. He just looked at his army and what was going on in his life. But enter, here you go, little David. Little David into the scene. 3 of his brothers are off fighting with King Saul at this particular battle. So Jesse told, Jesse is David's dad, he said, "Hey, David, go take some food to your brothers." So that was what he was doing there. Verse 20 said this, "So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded. As he came to the camp, as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle, for Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him," this is verse 26, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Isn't that amazing? Like, David's looking around going, what is wrong with all of you people? Like, do you not see that God is so much bigger than the giant? Verse 32, then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant, little David, will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're a youth, and he's a man of war from his youth." But here is what David knew about God. He knew that he could protect him and give him victory, even over a giant. See, that's a great lesson for us today. We look at life and we think, oh my gosh, we can never handle this. And God's like, would you stop? I'm going to handle this for you if you just let me and trust me. Look at verse 34. This is why he trusted God. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it." He said, "Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." I love David. He looks at this giant as, what a joke. Who is he compared to the living God? Verse 37 says this, "Moreover, David said, 'The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine.' And Saul said, 'Go, may the Lord be with you.'" Isn't that amazing? David gives God all the credit for rescuing him all of his life. He never takes credit like, yeah, I just know how to deal with bears and lions. He doesn't do that. Everything is about God. Verse 40 says this, "Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine." And he puts the Philistine Goliath in his place. You think you're so powerful, Mr. Goliath. Just wait. You don't know my God. Verse 45 says this, "Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel.'" Best verses ever. Little David standing up against them, saying, look, it's just me, but it's me with God. Me plus God, you lose every time. Verse 49 says, "Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell to the face of the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran over and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled." So with that story in the background, we see David has this unbelievable faith and trust in God. No fear for a giant. Faith to know that God would just take care of him. Because David just knew God. He'd spent so much time with him. And when you spend time with God, you get to know him. And then you learn how to trust him. So with that story in the background, let's pick up Psalms 9. Verse 1 says this. David's saying this to God. He says, "I will praise you, O Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonders. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High." Why does he praise God? And it's because he remembers. He remembers everything that God has done for him. No matter whatever happened in David's life, the turmoil, the tragedy, what had always helped him was this, remembering who God is and what he had done for him. When you remember what God had done for you, it does for you and has done for you in the past, it changes how you view what you're going through today. For David, he remembered how God rescued him from the giant Goliath, and how God made sure that those little tiny stones hit Goliath right at the exact place in his head that it needed to go. See, I think when you and I can start grasping how big and powerful God really honestly is, I think when we understand that he cares for us personally like he did with David, I just think it affects how we view our life. When we can look at, in light of everything, but my God can do anything. When we can look at life like that, like God can do anything. He really is in control. Verse 3, my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have upheld my right and my cause, and have sat on your throne judging righteously. He's saying, all those guys, they stumbled and fell. They were gone. Bye-bye, guys, because God is that big. David had seen God come through over and over and over. And he knew that God would always judge righteously. God, I know you know what's going on in this situation, and I'm praying that you will judge righteously. This is just a reminder to us. Because a lot of times we look around and we see all the evil, and I bet Israel was looking at this army and terrified, and they're like, what's wrong with this world? But we look around at the evil and we wonder, where is God? Where is God in all of this? But God says he is the ultimate judge. And even if someone seems to be getting away with something on this earth, there is an entire eternity that people will face judgment for. Verse 5 says this in Psalms 9, you have rebuked the nations and destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their names forever and ever. Endless ruin has overtaken the enemy. You have uprooted their cities. Even the memory of them has perished. Why? The Lord reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He will judge the world in righteousness. He will govern the people with justice. See, whenever the world seems really, really out of control, understand this, it kind of isn't. It may seem like that, but God reigns. The Lord reigns forever. And we need to remember this next verse. Verse 9, the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Think of a refuge being a place for, a place of safety. Think of a stronghold like a fortified city. It gives me this mental picture of God's protection of what happens in our life. Verse 10 says this, those who know your name will trust you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. That's a really, really great reminder that we have to trust God, even though a lot of times it seems like God has disappeared out of our life. And I want to stop and talk about that for a minute, because a lot of you don't have the ooey gooey thank you God feelings like David has. For some of you, you're in a really bad place and you're confused, wondering like, why isn't God coming through for me like he did for David? Like maybe for you, you've prayed for somebody that God would heal them and they died. Maybe you prayed for something good to happen, but it didn't. Maybe you prayed for healing, but you got worse. We have to just remember this when it comes to God and living on this earth, that we live in a fallen world where there are giants in our life. And there's people that are after us, and there's sickness that's just in this world. We need to remember that evil has a hold here. Sin is rampant. But I realize that when I read these Psalms, it makes me understand that there's more to life than just what we see here. That yes, that person may have died. Yes, something bad might have happened. Yes, I'm still sick, but my job here on this earth is not to worry about those things. My job here on this earth is to seek God and get to know him no matter what my circumstances are. Because if in fact, when I die, I know that moment I will step into eternity and be with Jesus forever. Because the Bible promises me he will never forsake me. Move on to verse 11. Sing praises to the Lord. Enthroned in Zion, proclaim among the nations what he has done. It's like David saying, remember everything God has done, especially this scene with David and Goliath. Remember how powerful God is. Verse 12, for he who avenges blood remembers. He does not ignore the cries of the afflicted. So for David in this psalm, he ends it singing praises to God. And he remembers how God came through for him. But he talks about it in light of his trials for the day. And then he moves from praise to prayer. And he asks God for help today because he remembers what God did for him in the past. Look at verse 13. O Lord, see how my enemies persecute me. Have mercy and lift me up from the gates of death. See, here's what David knew. God, if I die, I die. But I won't die if you step in. Like the only way I'm not going to die, and maybe it was the David and Goliath thing, maybe he's running from Saul, like whatever this situation is in his life, maybe it was he was running from his son Absalom, but he knew that if God did not step in and save him, that he would die. He trusted him that much with his life. Some people are so fearful of death, and I'm like, I don't know, God's given you a number of days to live. When that's up, you die, okay? There's nothing to worry about it. Just relax. Enjoy your time here. But here's what's so amazing about David, is that David says something that most of us would never say. We don't see David saying this. Oh God, don't let me die because I just want to see my grandchildren get married. Oh God, don't let me die. I really want to finish this business deal first. Oh God, don't let me die. I want to see the Cardinals win the Super Bowl, okay? That may take all of eternity for that to happen. But look at why he doesn't want to die. It has nothing to do with those things. Look at verse 14. He says, lift me up from the gates, that I may declare your praises in the gates of the daughter of Zion, and there rejoice in your salvation. He's saying, have mercy on me. Lift me from the gates of death. Why? So I can tell people about you. I can declare your praises to other people in hopes that they can find you. David wanted people to know God. Imagine, like seriously, imagine this. Imagine if that's the only reason we really actually want to live. So others can know Jesus. Like to be a light in this world so that we can say, look, there's an eternity waiting. Please give your life to Jesus. What if we actually cared more about that than if our kids got married or if we finished the business? What if that was first and foremost in our life? Because it's supposed to be. Remember, as a follower of Jesus, Paul says that in Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ. To die is gain. See, that's really good news. Verse 15 says this, the nations have fallen into the pit they have dug. Their feet are caught in the net they have hidden. The Lord is known by his justice. The wicked are ensnared by the work of their hands. And then there's two words. It says Higgaion and Selah. Higgaion means a somber interlude. So remember, these were songs. So these words were put to songs, and then suddenly we see this Higgaion and Selah, a somber interlude. Why? Because now David is talking about judgment. People are going to be judged, and when you're judged and you don't know Jesus, you're going to spend eternity in hell. That's somber. That's cause to step back and have somber reflection. And you and I should feel that way all the time because we see it every day. People refuse the offer of salvation through Jesus. It's right there, the cross. Jesus rose from the grave. Historically, everything, it's right there, and people don't want it. And if they don't give their life to Jesus and they don't believe it, they'll spend eternity under judgment in hell. And that's terrifying. But I've learned that most people don't want to come to Jesus because if they do, they're going to have to change. Their life will have to change. So, if they don't, there's nothing we can do about it. But there is an eternity of judgment awaiting people who've never given their life to Christ. Verse 17 says this, the wicked return to the grave, all the nations that forget God. But the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted ever perish. Why? Because God is the ultimate judge. God judges. He says in verse 19, "Arise, O Lord, let not man triumph. Let the nations be judged in your presence. Strike them with terror, O Lord. Let the nations know they are but men. Selah." I love how this psalm ends. Let the nations know that they're just men. They're not that important. It reminds me of Psalm 2, all the way back when we did Psalm 2. Verse 1, "Why did the nations conspire and the people plot in vain?" What is wrong with these people who want nothing to do with God? He says, "The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one." Look at verse 4. "The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them." See, for us, we look around and we see all the wickedness in this earth. But I want you to leave today watching this psalm, understanding this and really rest assured that it's not always going to be like this. We have a promise from God that one day nations and people will be judged. One day there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and one day Jesus will reign forever and ever. So in the meantime, what should we do? Well, we need to pray. We need to pray for those who are wicked and those who are evil and those that really need Jesus, that God will turn their hearts to him. We need to trust God that all the evil around us, that we know God will judge that. And we have to trust him that he will judge the unrighteous. But the main lesson I think from David today is this. We need to spend our days getting to know and trust and love this amazing God, just like David did. So when our days turn bad, they turn bleak, kind of like this life just isn't going that good. I just want you to remember, like David's trying to get through to us, that it's only for a little while longer. Jesus will come back and set things right. And for us, that is amazing hope. Hope that helps you today. Have a really good day.